Good evening, dear listener. Come settle yourself comfortably. Perhaps you have a warm cup of tea cradled in your hands, the steam rising softly, carrying the faint scent of bergamot or chamomile. Let the day slip away. Allow your shoulders to ease, your breathing to slow. Tonight, we share a calm mystery, one woven gently, thread by thread, with no need for haste or alarm. If these soothing tales bring you peace, do consider subscribing for more comforting mysteries to accompany your evenings. Now breathe in and let us begin. In the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, a small cream card rests on a polished table. Tea with Miss Marple, Thursday at 4 o'clock. Nothing could be more ordinary, more civilized. A solicitor arrives, or rather, does not. Instead, your young clerk brings polite apologies and a message delivered precisely on time. Yet in that tiny alteration of schedule, something begins to whisper. A favorite bench in a quiet copse. A diary entry crossed out with perfect ruler lines. A man famous for never missing an appointment, who suddenly keeps one final, unbreakable one. Dear listener, sometimes the most courteous invitation hides the most carefully arranged goodbye. Relax now, breathe slowly. Let the gentle mystery begin, exactly when it should. Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginning. In the small, unhurried village of St. Mary Mead, Thursday afternoons had long ago settled into a pattern as regular as the chime of the church clock at the top of the hour. The days in late September carried a soft golden light that filtered through the leaves of the lime trees along the lane, and turning everything slightly hazy and warm, as though the world itself had decided to take things more slowly. Cottage gardens still bloomed bravely, dahlias standing tall in crimson and butter yellow, Michaelmas daisies spilling over low stone walls, and roses, especially the roses, holding on to their last petals with quiet dignity. Miss Jane Marple lived in the middle cottage of three that looked out across the green. Her front parlor window commanded a perfect view. The post office on the left, the butcher's boy cycling past with his basket, old Mrs. Dane picking the last of her blackberries from the hedge that bordered the lane. Nothing escaped notice, though Miss Marple would never have called it spying. She simply observed, the way one observes the habits of robins or the precise moment when lavender begins to release its strongest scent. Today she sat in her favorite armchair, the one upholstered in faded chintz roses that had once been bright pink, but were now a gentle blush. A small pie crust table stood beside her, holding her work basket, a pair of fine steel needles, and a ball of soft lavender wool. She was knitting a shawl, nothing elaborate, just a simple lace pattern that grew row by row, like the turning of seasons. Every few stitches, she glanced up at the mantel clock. It showed 12 minutes to 4. On the low table near the window, she had arranged everything with care. A tray covered in fine white linen held 3 coal-pot cups and saucers, their pattern of tiny forget-me-nots, almost worn away from years of use, and beside them rested a matching teapot under a cozy knitted in the same lavender wool, a small jug of milk, a bowl of sugar lumps, and a plate of scones still warm from the oven, wrapped in a clean cloth to keep the steam in. A pot of strawberry jam and a dish of clotted cream completed the picture. Nothing ostentatious, Miss Marple disliked display, but everything correct, everything in its place. She had made the appointment herself, and she had made it quite firmly. Mr. Edward Harrow, the solicitor who had taken over Mr. Petherick's practice 2 years earlier, was to call at precisely 4 o'clock. The matter was small, almost trivial. A disagreement between two neighbors over a rose arbor that straddled the boundary line between their gardens. Old Mrs. and Carruthers insisted the arbor, and therefore the climbing new dawn roses that covered it, belonged entirely to her side of the fence. Young Mr. Linton, who had bought the adjoining cottage only last spring, maintained that half the roots lay on his land, and that he therefore had every right to enjoy the blooms. Letters had been exchanged, tempers had risen, quietly, as was the way in St. Mary Mead, and eventually the matter had come to the solicitor's desk. Miss Marple had known both parties for decades. She also knew that what appeared on paper to be a question of property was, in truth, something quite different. A long-standing difference in temperament, a touch of jealousy over garden prizes at the summer fete, and perhaps, just perhaps, a very old, half-forgotten slight involving a church bazaar and a particularly fine sponge cake. On such things mattered in villages. They mattered a great deal. She had therefore written to Mr. Harrow, suggesting that, rather than exchange more letters or arrange a formal meeting in his office with its smell of old deed boxes and beeswax polish, he might care to call at her cottage for tea. A quiet conversation over a cup, she had phrased it, often untangles more than a dozen legal paragraphs. He had accepted by return post, his handwriting neat and punctilious, confirming Thursday at 4. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she turned a row of knitting. An appointment was, after all, one of the small civilities that kept life pleasant. One made a promise of time and attention. The other party accepted it in good faith. When honored, it created a little island of order in an uncertain world. When broken, it left ripples, small ones, perhaps, but ripples nonetheless. Outside, a blackbird sang from the top of the holly bush, 3 clear notes repeated with lazy confidence. A bicycle bell tinkled farther down the lane, probably the grocer's boy delivering late orders. The scent of wood smoke drifted in through the slightly open window, mingling with the fragrance of the scones and the faint lavender rising from her wool. 10 minutes to 4. She set her knitting aside for a moment and rose to check the kettle on the gas ring in the tiny kitchen. It had just begun to sing, a soft, rising note that promised to deepen into a full boil. She turned down the flame a fraction, then returned to the parlor. Everything was ready. The fire in the grate burned low and steady, more for cheerfulness than warmth on this mild afternoon. A vase of late roses, pale pink and cream, stood on the mantel, their petals just beginning to curl at the edges. Miss Marple sat again, folding her hands in her lap. She did not feel impatient. Waiting, she had always thought, was a skill like any other. One could wait anxiously, or one could wait calmly, letting the moments arrange themselves like stitches on a needle. She thought of Mr. Harrow, a quiet man, perhaps 45, with careful manners and a habit of polishing his spectacles when thinking. He had come down from London after old Mr. Petherick's retirement, bringing with him a reputation for thoroughness and a slight air of being perpetually surprised by how slowly village life moved. Yet he had adapted. He kept regular hours, answered letters promptly, and most importantly, honored his appointments. And Miss Marple approved of that. Reliability, she believed, was the foundation of good character. The clock ticked on, 7 minutes to 4. She picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly in time with the pendulum. The shawl was perhaps a third complete. soon she would begin the border of tiny eyelet holes that gave it lightness. She liked patterns that repeated predictably. There was comfort in knowing exactly what the next stitch would be. Outside, footsteps sounded on the path, slow, measured, not hurried. Miss Marple's lips curved in a small, pleased smile. Punctuality was a virtue too seldom praised. The doorbell chimed, clear, polite, exactly on the hour. She set her work aside, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door, ready to welcome her guest and begin what she expected to be a perfectly ordinary, a perfectly civilized afternoon. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. The doorbell's chime faded into the quiet house, leaving only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the distant call of a wood pigeon from the lime trees. Miss Marple opened the door with her usual calm courtesy, expecting to see Mr. Harrow's familiar figure. Tall, slightly stooped at the shoulders from years over deed boxes, spectacles perched precisely on the bridge of his nose. Instead, she found Timothy Wren. The young clerk stood on the scrubbed doorstep, hat held in both hands, and twisted slightly, as though he were wringing out invisible water. He was barely 20, still carrying the awkward lankiness of late boyhood. His fair hair neatly combed, but already beginning to lift at the front from nervous habit. His cheeks were flushed from the brisk walk down the lane, and a faint sheen of perspiration showed along his upper lip, despite the mild September air. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, the words coming out a little too quickly. Mr. Harrow sends his deepest apologies. He was unexpectedly called away to the station to meet a client arriving on the 3:45 from London. He asked me to come in person and explain that he will telephone tomorrow morning to reschedule. He was most particular about that. About coming in person, I mean. Miss Marple tilted her head a fraction, regarding him with the same mild interest she might give to a new variety of rose just beginning to open. "How very conscientious of him," she murmured. "And of you, Mr. Wren, to walk all this way on such short notice." "It's no trouble, ma'am. I truly—" Timothy shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Mr. Harrow said, "Well," he said, "an appointment is an appointment. Even if it's only to say it can't be kept, it should be done properly." Miss Marple's lips curved in the smallest of smiles. "A most sensible principle. Do come inside for a moment, Mr. Wren. The kettle has only just boiled, and it would be a pity to let a fresh pot go to waste." The young man hesitated, glancing back toward the lane, as though half expecting to see his employer appear at any second to relieve him of this duty. Then he stepped over the threshold, careful to wipe his shoes twice on the coconut mat, though they carried no visible mud. Miss Marple closed the door softly behind him and led the way into the parlor. The tea tray still waited, unchanged, the scones still warm beneath their cloth. She gestured toward the armchair usually reserved for guests. The one with the slightly higher back that made people sit up straighter without realizing it. "Do sit down," she said. "You look as though you've hurried." Timothy perched on the edge of the seat rather than settling back, hat now balanced awkwardly on his knee. "I came as quickly as I could after Mr. Harrow left. He was quite firm about the timing." Miss Marple busied herself with the teapot, pouring with the steady hand of long practice. Steam rose in gentle spirals, carrying the fragrance of Earl Grey, bergamot, and black tea, comforting and familiar. She passed him a cup, milk already added. Just as she remembered, he took it from previous short visits to the cottage on errands. "There," she said. "That will steady you." He accepted it with both hands, and as though afraid the saucer might tilt. "Thank you, Mom." For a few moments, they sat in companionable quiet, the only sounds the tick of the clock, the faint crackle of the low fire, and the occasional sip Timothy took, too hot, judging by the way he blew gently across the surface before each mouthful. Miss Marple observed him, without appearing to do so, the slight tremor in his left hand, quickly concealed by wrapping both around the cup, the ink smudge on the inside cuff of his left sleeve, dark and still faintly glossy, as though made only that morning. The way his eyes kept drifting, not toward the window or the roses outside, but toward the grandfather clock in the corner of the hall, visible through the open doorway. "You've been with Mr. Harrow how long now?" she asked, after a suitable pause. "8 months, Mum, or since last January." "And you find the work agreeable?" "Very much so. He's patient, explains things properly. Not like some solicitors who expect you to know everything the first week." Miss Marple nodded. "He strikes me as a man who values precision. The sort who would never leave a letter unanswered or an appointment unaccounted for." Timothy's fingers tightened briefly around the cup. "That's right. He keeps his diary like clockwork. Every entry in the same blue ink. Every crossing out done with a ruler so the line is perfectly straight." How admirable. She took a small sip of her own tea. And yet today, an unexpected client from London proved more urgent than our little discussion of rose arbors. Timothy looked down into his cup. He seemed preoccupied this morning, more than usual. He kept turning back through the diary pages, last week, the week before, as though he was checking something he'd written earlier. Twice he asked me whether the London train was reliably on time. I told him that 3:45 is almost always punctual, barring fog or leaves on the line. Miss Marple set her cup down with a soft clink. And did he seem satisfied with that answer? I think so. He just nodded and said, "Good. Then there's time." "Time," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. She glanced toward the clock herself. 4:12. The afternoon light had begun to slant more steeply across the carpet, gilding the edges of the tea tray and catching the tiny motes of dust that danced in the beam. Timothy finished his tea in a quick gulp, as though suddenly aware he had stayed longer than intended. He set the cup and saucer carefully on the tray. "I should be getting back, Mom. Mr. Harrow may telephone the office later, and I ought to be there." "Of course." Miss Marple rose with him. "Give him my kind regards when you see him. And tell him I quite understand how appointments can rearrange themselves at short notice." Timothy managed a small, grateful smile. "I will, Mom. Thank you for the tea. It was, very welcome." She walked him to the door, opened it, and watched as he stepped back into the lane. He replaced his hat, gave a small, awkward half bow, and set off at a brisk pace toward the village center. His shoulders were hunched slightly, as though carrying something heavier than a hat and a message. Miss Marple remained in the doorway a moment longer. The blackbird had returned to the holly bush and was singing again, 3 clear notes. It repeated with the same lazy confidence. The roses along the path nodded in the breeze, releasing a faint sweetness into the air. Everything appeared exactly as it had an hour earlier, peaceful, orderly, ordinary. Yet something about the afternoon felt subtly altered, like a familiar piece of music played with one note ever so slightly delayed. She closed the door quietly, returned to the parlor, and stood for a long moment beside the tea tray. The scones remained untouched, The pot was still warm. She reached out and gently straightened the cloth that covered them, smoothing it with the flat of her hand. An appointment, she reflected, was after all only a small promise of time shared. When kept, it bound people together in civility. When altered, it left a tiny space, an absence that could be filled with other things, questions, in observations, the slow turning over of small details in the mind. She picked up her knitting once more, settled back into the chintz armchair, and began the next row. The lavender wool slipped smoothly through her fingers. The needles clicked in their steady, soothing rhythm. Outside, the light continued to soften. The village moved on about its quiet business. And somewhere, Miss Marple thought, a small thread had been pulled, just enough to make the whole pattern shift if one looked at it long enough and from the right angle. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The afternoon following Timothy Wren's visit slipped quietly into evening, as September afternoons in St. Mary Mead so often did. The golden light faded first from the tops of the lime trees, then from the church spire, until only a soft lavender dusk remained over the rooftops. Miss Marple had cleared the tea tray herself. No need to trouble Mrs. Price's granddaughter, who came in twice a week and would only worry about scones gone uneaten. She carried the tray to the kitchen, rinsed the delicate cups under the tap, dried them with a linen cloth, and returned them to their place in the dresser. Small rituals, performed without haste, brought their own calm. She did not sit down to knit again immediately. Instead, she moved to the window of the parlor, drew the curtains halfway against the gathering chill, and stood looking out across the green. The village was settling for the night, lights appearing in cottage windows one by one, the faint clatter of shutters being fastened, the occasional bark of a dog answered by another farther down the lane. Everything moved at its accustomed pace. Yet Miss Marple's mind turned, gently and without urgency, over the small details of the afternoon. Timothy Wren had been polite, earnest, and beneath the politeness, unmistakably uneasy. Not the dramatic unease of someone hiding a great secret, but the quiet discomfort of youth caught between loyalty and confusion. His hands had trembled when he first took the cup. He had hidden the tremor by wrapping both palms around the china. A natural enough reaction after hurrying along the lane, one might say. Yet the tremor had returned, more faintly, when he spoke of Mr. Harrow turning back through the diary pages, and that ink smudge on his left cuff, dark, still slightly glossy, suggested writing done in haste, perhaps that very morning. A clerk's cuff was often marked by ink. That was no surprise. But the position of the smudge, high on the inside rather than the outer edge, spoke of someone writing with the left hand pressed close to the paper, shielding what was being written. She considered Timothy's words again, letting them settle like leaves in still water. Mr. Harrow had been preoccupied. He had checked the diary repeatedly. He had asked twice about the punctuality of the 3:45 train, and he had said, "Then there's time." Time for what? Miss Marple turned from the window and moved to her small writing desk in the corner. She opened the top drawer, took out a slim notebook bound in soft blue cloth, and sat down. She did not write at once. For several minutes, she simply sat, pencil in hand, allowing the afternoon's impressions to arrange themselves. First, punctuality. Mr. Harrow was known for it, and the village had remarked on it when he first arrived. How different he was from old Mr. Petherick, who had kept appointments in the way a cat keeps appointments with a sunbeam whenever it suited. Mr. Harrow arrived at church precisely as the bells ceased, delivered papers on the day promised, telephoned when he said he would telephone. Reliability had become his hallmark. Second, the diary. Timothy had described it as kept like clockwork. Every entry in blue ink, crossings out, ruled with precision. A man who valued order so highly would not lightly alter an appointment, especially not one made at the suggestion of Miss Marple herself, whom he treated with careful deference. Third, the rescheduling. To send the clerk rather than a note or a telephone message suggested intention. A note might have been mislaid, and a telephone call might have gone unanswered if Miss Marple had been in the garden. But a personal visit, on foot, in the middle of a busy afternoon, ensured the message was delivered exactly as intended, at the appointed hour. She opened the notebook at a fresh page and wrote, in her small, neat hand, "Appointment made, Thursday, 4 p.m. Appointment altered, same day, same hour. Messenger, Timothy Wren, young, loyal, nervous. Reason given, client on 3:45 train from London." Additional behavior, checking diary repeatedly, asking about train time, remark, "Then there's time." She paused, tapped the pencil once against her lower lip, then added, "Left cuff, fresh ink smudge. Inside edge, hands, slight tremor, concealed, nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. Only the small discrepancies that appear when one pattern is laid over another and fails quite to match." She closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. Later, after she had eaten a light supper of bread and butter and a slice of seed cake, she took her usual evening walk along the lane that skirted the green. The air had cooled. She wore her old tweed coat and a woolen scarf the color of ripe plums. She passed the butcher's shop, already shuttered, and the post office, where a single light burned upstairs in the living quarters. She nodded to Mrs. Dane, who was sweeping her doorstep, and exchanged a few words about the promise of frost. As she approached the solicitor's office, a modest building of red brick with a brass plate beside the door, she slowed her pace. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, and no light showed in the upstairs rooms where Mr. Harrow had his private sitting room. Yet something caught her eye. The small brass letterbox beside the door gleamed as though recently polished, and on the step lay a single petal from a late rose, pale pink, freshly fallen, not yet wilted. Miss Marple bent and picked it up. It smelled faintly of summer, though summer was long past. She turned it between her fingers, then placed it carefully in her coat pocket. She continued her walk, circling the green until she reached her own gate once more. The night had grown quiet. Only the soft hoot of an owl carried from the copse beyond the railway line. Inside the cottage, she locked the door, drew the curtains fully, and lit the lamp beside her chair. She took up her knitting again. The lavender shawl had grown several inches since yesterday, and resumed the steady rhythm of stitch after stitch. Yet her thoughts continued their gentle circling. People, she reflected, revealed themselves most clearly in the small habits they thought went unnoticed. A man who polished his letterbox on an ordinary weekday evening was a man attending to details. A young clerk who hid a trembling hand was a young clerk carrying more than his employer's message. And a solicitor who altered an appointment with such careful courtesy was a solicitor who wished to leave no loose ends. She did not yet know what those loose ends might be. She felt no urgency to discover them tonight. The fire burned low. The clock in the hall chimed 9, then the quarter hour. Outside, the village slept. Miss Marple turned another row, counted the stitches under her breath, and allowed the quiet to settle around her like a familiar shawl. Tomorrow, perhaps, more would become clear. For now, observation was enough. Observation, after all, was only another way of waiting, calmly, patiently, for the pattern to reveal itself, stitch by stitch. Chapter 4. A Calm Contradiction. Friday morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with the same unhurried gentleness as every other day. A thin mist lay over the green until the sun rose high enough to burn it away, leaving the grass damp and silvered. The church clock struck 8. Doors opened. Milk bottles clinked on doorsteps. The butcher's boy whistled his way up the lane with the first deliveries. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet by 9:30, the village had begun to hum with the particular quiet excitement that follows news both unexpected and discreet. Miss Marple heard it first from Mrs. Dane, who stopped at the garden gate on her way back from the post office. A brown paper parcel of knit-in wool tucked under one arm. "Have you heard, Miss Marple? Poor Mr. Harrow. They found him this morning, quite early, in the little copse behind the station, sitting on that old bench by the footpath, as peaceful as anything. Only he wasn't breathing." Miss Marple, who had been deadheading the last of the roses with a pair of small secateurs, paused and straightened slowly. "Dear me," she said softly. "How very sad. Was it his heart, do you think?" Mrs. Dane lowered her voice, though no one else was near. The doctor came straight away, Dr. Haydock himself, and at first glance he said heart failure. But then he looked closer and called the police from Much Benham. There's talk of, well, of something not quite natural. Digitalis, they're saying. You know how careful he was about his health. Never a drop too much of anything. It doesn't add up. Miss Marple snipped one final faded bloom and placed it in the trug at her feet. People do surprise us sometimes, even when we think we know them well. Mrs. Dane nodded, glanced toward the lane as though expecting to see Inspector Craddock's car already turning the corner, then hurried on her way. By midday, the news had spread in the careful roundabout fashion of village gossip. A telephone call here, a remark over the garden fence there, a brief word at the butcher's counter. No one raised their voice. No one gathered in excited knots. St. Mary Mead preferred its shocks to arrive wrapped in decorum. Inspector Craddock arrived just after lunch, driving himself in the plain black car the county provided. He was a tall man in his late 30s, with the quiet competence of someone who had learned early that haste rarely solved anything. He called first at Miss Marple's cottage, as he always did when events touched the village in an unusual way. She received him in the parlor, the same room where the tea tray had waited the day before. The fire burned low, the lavender shawl lay folded over the arm of her chair. She offered him coffee, strong, black, the way he liked it, and they sat opposite one another at the small pie-crust table. Craddock opened his notebook but did not write at once. "Mr. Harrow was found at 6:30 this morning," he began. "A railway porter taking a short cut through the copse saw him on the bench and thought at first he was asleep. When he didn't stir, the porter went closer. No signs of struggle, no disarray. Just a man sitting quietly, coat buttoned against the night chill, hands folded in his lap. The doctor estimates time of death between 10 o'clock and midnight last night." Miss Marple listened without interruption, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Craddock continued. "Several people confirm he was at the station yesterday afternoon. He met the 3:45 from London, spoke briefly with the passenger who got off, a middle-aged gentleman carrying a briefcase. They stood on the platform for perhaps 5 minutes. Then Mr. Harrow walked away toward the cops. That was the last sighting until the porter this morning. He paused, studying her face. You had an appointment with him at 4 o'clock yesterday. I did, Miss Marple replied calmly. He sent his clerk, young Timothy Wren, to explain that an urgent client had arrived on the train. Mr. Harrow would telephone today to reschedule. Craddock made a small note. Timothy Wren has confirmed that. He says Harrow left the office just before 3, mentioning the London train specifically. Miss Marple inclined her head. And the cause? Digitalis poisoning. Not a massive dose. Enough to slow the heart gradually, peacefully. The sort of thing that might be mistaken for natural failure if one didn't look closely. No note, no obvious reason. But he had no prescription for digitalis. His own doctor confirms he was in excellent health, blood pressure steady, heart sound. He took nothing stronger than an occasional aspirin. A silence followed, broken only by the soft settling of a coal in the grate. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice gentle. An appointment. Craddock looked up. Mr. Harrow kept his life by appointments, she went on. Every hour accounted for, every promise honored. Yesterday he made several. One with me at 4. One, apparently, with the client from London at the station. And then another. She lifted her eyes to meet the inspector's. He walked to the cops after speaking to his visitor. He sat on the bench, the one with the view across the fields toward the village. He waited. And at the appointed time, whatever he had taken began to work, quietly, without fuss. Craddock frowned. You're suggesting suicide? I'm suggesting nothing yet, Miss Marple answered. Only that the word appointment seems to recur. He altered one appointment to keep another. He sent a messenger to ensure the first was properly cancelled. And he chose a place where he would not be disturbed for several hours, long enough for whatever he had planned to reach its conclusion. She paused, then added almost absently, one might almost call it murder by appointment. Craddock gave a short, surprised laugh that held no mirth. That's a rather dramatic phrase, Miss Marple. Perhaps. But drama is not always loud, Inspector. Sometimes it arrives in the form of perfect punctuality. He studied her for a long moment. You think there's more here than a man choosing to end his own life? I think, she said quietly, that when a man as orderly as Mr. Harrow arranges his final hours with such care, we owe it to him to look closely at the arrangement. Not because we suspect foul play in the usual sense, but because the pattern may not be quite what it appears. Craddock closed his notebook. The postmortem will tell us more. I've asked for a thorough toxicology report. In the meantime, we're going through his papers, diary, letters, accounts. If anything strikes you, I shall tell you at once, Miss Marple promised. He rose to leave. At the door, he paused. You're not surprised? No, she said simply. I am puzzled. There is a difference. After he had gone, she returned to her chair, took up the lavender shawl, and began to knit once more. The needles moved steadily, row by row. Outside, the afternoon light slanted across the green, touching the roses that still bloomed along the path. An appointment kept, an appointment altered, in an appointment with death itself, chosen, timed, executed with the same meticulous courtesy Mr. Harrow had shown in every other area of his life. Yet somewhere in that careful sequence lay a small contradiction, a note that did not quite fit the melody. Miss Marple did not hurry to find it. She simply continued knitting, letting the quiet contradiction settle in her mind like a dropped stitch waiting to be noticed. The clock ticked on. The village moved through its ordinary afternoon, and the pattern, though still incomplete, had begun to reveal its first faint outline. Chapter 5. A detail revisited Saturday morning brought a gentle change in the weather. The mist had lifted entirely, leaving the sky a clear, pale blue that made the village look freshly washed. Dew still clung to the spider webs strung between the rose bushes, and the air carried the clean scent of damp earth and fading summer. In Miss Marple's cottage, the windows stood open to let in the freshness. A small breeze stirred the net curtains and moved the pages of the open notebook on her writing desk. She had not slept long the previous night, though her rest had been peaceful. Instead, she had lain in the dark, letting the facts of Mr. Harrow's death settle and rearrange themselves like pieces in a patience game. No sudden revelations had come, no dramatic flash of insight, but one small detail from Thursday afternoon had begun to glow quietly in her mind, the way a single dropped stitch will eventually draw the eye in an otherwise perfect piece of knitting. Timothy Wren arrived just after 10 o'clock, summoned by a brief note delivered by the postboy. He came on foot again, hat in hand, his face pale and his eyes shadowed, as though sleep had eluded him too. Miss Marple met him at the door with her usual mild warmth. "Do come in, Mr. Wren. I've made coffee this morning, stronger than tea. I thought you might need it." He followed her into the parlor without protest. The room was the same as before, fire lit low against the morning chill, lavender shawl draped over the armchair, the scent of roses drifting in from the open window. But the tea tray had been replaced by a small tray bearing a cafetiere, 2 sturdy mugs, a jug of milk, and a plate of shortbread fingers still warm from the oven. Timothy sat on the edge of the chair as before, though this time he did not perch quite so rigidly. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the simple relief of being invited rather than sent on an errand. Miss Marple poured the coffee. He added milk to his without asking. She remembered from the previous visit and passed him the mug. She took her own black and settled opposite him. "I won't waste your time with pleasantries," she began quietly. "You've had a difficult few days, and I imagine the police have asked you many questions already. I have only 1 or 2, and they concern something you mentioned when you were last here." Timothy nodded, cradling the mug between his palms, as though drawing warmth from it. "You spoke of Mr. Harrow's diary," she continued. "How meticulously he kept it. Blue ink, ruled crossings out, everything in order. You said he turned back through the pages that morning, checking something." "Yes, Mum." "And you mentioned an entry from the previous Wednesday. You didn't quote it exactly, but I wondered whether you might remember more now." Timothy's gaze dropped to the coffee. He took a slow sip, then set the mug on the small table beside him. "It was squeezed in," he said at last. "Between 2 other appointments, Wednesday, 4 o'clock. Just JMT in his usual handwriting, but fainter, as though added later. And underneath it, in firmer strokes, the same ink, but pressed harder. Confirmed dose." Miss Marple nodded once, slowly. "Confirmed dose," she repeated softly. "And you fetched a bottle from the chemist for him last week, you said. For his heart." Timothy's shoulders rose and fell in a deep, unsteady breath. "Yes, he asked me on Tuesday. Said his sister used to take digitalis for her heart condition, and he'd been feeling a flutter himself lately. Nothing serious, he said. Just precautionary. He gave me the prescription and the money, asked me to collect it after lunch and bring it straight back. I did. He put the bottle in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked it, and thanked me. That was all. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Mr. Harrow never took digitalis, she said. Not a question, a gentle statement. Timothy looked up, startled. No, Mum, not that I ever saw. He was proud of his health. Used to joke that he'd outlive us all on willpower and walking to the station every morning instead of taking the bus. He drank chamomile at night for sleep. Nothing else. I didn't think anything of it at the time. He was the employer. If he said it was for his heart, who was I to question? Quite right, Miss Marple murmured. But now, looking back, Timothy's voice dropped to a near whisper. Now it seems deliberate, or as though he was making preparations. Miss Marple reached for the notebook on the desk, opened it to the page where she had listed the small observations from Thursday. She read them silently once more, then closed it. An appointment with me at 4 o'clock on Thursday, she said. An entry made earlier, JMT, perhaps on Wednesday, when the plan was still forming. Then later, the addition. Confirmed dose. A reminder to himself, not of medicine to take daily, but of a single dose to be taken at the appointed time. Timothy stared at her. You mean, he planned it? All of it? I mean, he arranged it. Miss Marple corrected gently. With the same care, he arranged everything else. The train from London, to provide a reason for leaving the office early. On the meeting on the platform, to speak with someone. Perhaps to give instructions about the client's affairs after his death. The walk to the copse, his favorite quiet place. The bench where he could sit and wait without interruption. And the dose, carefully measured, taken at the right moment so that by the time anyone found him, the matter would appear natural at first glance. She paused, letting the words settle. But why send you to me, Mr. Wren? Why make sure I knew the appointment was cancelled? Timothy swallowed. He said you were the sort of person who noticed things, that if he simply didn't appear, you might worry or wonder or even go looking for him. He wanted the message delivered in person at 4 o'clock precisely, so that the time would be accounted for, and so that no one would wait in vain. Miss Marple's expression softened, a kindness in its way. Timothy's eyes filled suddenly. He blinked hard, looked away toward the window. There's more, he said after a moment. Last week, he asked me to make copies of certain trust account papers. A client's fund, small but important. He told me to keep the copies in my own desk, sealed, and not to open them unless something happened to him. I thought it was just solicitor caution. Now I think he knew someone had been taking money. Not much, just enough to cause trouble if discovered. Miss Marple nodded. And he wished to protect the innocent and expose the truth without scandal. Timothy looked at her directly now. His nephew, he said quietly. The one who helps in the office sometimes. I didn't want to believe it. No, but the figures, they don't lie. The room was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock and the distant song of a blackbird in the garden. Miss Marple rose, crossed to the window, and stood looking out at the roses. The petals were beginning to fall more freely now. One drifted past the glass and settled on the sill. The pattern is becoming clearer, she said. not murder in the usual sense. No hand raised in anger, no poison slipped by stealth, but murder by appointment, his own appointment, chosen, timed, carried out with precision so that the questions would lead naturally to the answers he wished revealed. She turned back to Timothy. You were never meant to carry blame, my dear. You were meant to carry the message, and later, perhaps, the truth. Timothy bowed his head. A single tear fell into his coffee, unnoticed. Now Miss Marple returned to her chair. She did not press him further. There would be time for more questions, for explanations to Inspector Craddock, for the quiet unraveling of what remained. For now, the detail had been revisited. The faint entry in the diary, the added reminder, the bottle fetched from the chemist, they no longer sat as isolated facts. They had found their place in the larger design. The morning light strengthened. The village continued its ordinary Saturday business beyond the garden hedge. And in the small parlor, two people sat in silence, each holding a mug that had grown cool, each turning over in their minds the gentle, sorrowful logic of a man who had scheduled even his own departure. Chapter 6. Quiet explanation. Sunday afternoon in St. Mary Mead carried the particular stillness that follows a week of gentle upheaval. The church bells had rung for morning service. The congregation had dispersed in small groups along the lanes, exchanging nods and murmured farewells. By 3 o'clock, the village had returned to its private rhythms. Sunday roasts cooling on tables, newspapers spread across kitchen counters, children sent out to play in gardens, where the last of the Michaelmas daisies still stood. Miss Marple had chosen this hour deliberately. She sent 3 short notes by hand, one to Inspector Craddock at the Much Benham police station, one to Timothy Wren at his lodgings above the baker's shop, and one to Mrs. Price, who had kept the chemist's counter for 40 years and knew more about village prescriptions than most doctors. Each note was identical in its courtesy. If you would be so kind as to call at 4 o'clock this afternoon, there is a small matter I should like to explain. Tea will be waiting. They arrived within minutes of one another, almost as though they had walked together but maintained a polite distance. Inspector Craddock came first, parking his car discreetly behind the hedge and entering by the garden gate. Timothy followed, hatless, his hair still damp from a quick wash. Mrs. Price arrived last, carrying a small tin of her own shortbread as a contribution, though she knew Miss Marple's baking needed no supplement. Miss Marple welcomed each with the same calm warmth, taking coats, offering the fireside chairs, and pouring tea from the familiar pot. No scones this time, only thin slices of lemon drizzle cake. The crust sugared just enough to catch the light, and the shortbread Mrs. Price had brought. The room smelled of bergamot, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of late roses still blooming beyond the window. When they were all seated, cups in hand, Miss Marple spoke without preamble. "Thank you for coming," she began quietly. "I know the week has been difficult for each of you in different ways. What I have to say is not dramatic, nor will it require raised voices or hurried decisions. It is simply an explanation of how certain small things fit together when looked at steadily and without haste." She set her own cup on the saucer with a soft clink. Mr. Harrow was a man who lived by appointments. He made them, kept them, honored them, even when circumstances changed. Last Thursday, he had 3 that mattered particularly. The first was with me, here at 4 o'clock, to discuss a neighbor's rose arbor. The second was at the station, to meet a client arriving on the 3:45 from London. The third was with himself in the copse behind the station, on the bench he often used when he needed quiet thought. Inspector Craddock leaned forward slightly, but said nothing. Miss Marple continued. He did not keep the first appointment. Instead, he sent Timothy, carefully, personally, to explain why. He wished no one left waiting, no clock watched in vain. That small courtesy tells us something important. Even at the end, he was thinking of others. She looked at Timothy, who sat very still, hands clasped around his knees. You brought the message, Timothy, exactly at 4 o'clock. You told me Mr. Harrow had been preoccupied that morning, turning back through his diary, in asking twice about the train's punctuality, saying, then there's time. Those were not idle remarks. They were part of a plan made with precision. Timothy nodded once, barely perceptible. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Price. And you, my dear, will remember the prescription Timothy collected last Tuesday. Digitalis foxglove extract in a small brown bottle. Mr. Harrow told Timothy it was for his heart, but as we now know, he took no such medicine regularly. His own doctor confirms it. The bottle was never opened for daily use. It was kept locked in his desk drawer until Thursday. Mrs. Price's lips pressed together. She had suspected as much when the news first reached the shop, but had said nothing until asked. The dose, Miss Marple went on gently, was measured for a single purpose. Not to cause pain or alarm, but to bring a quiet end. And digitalis slows the heart gradually. First a gentle drowsiness, then deeper sleep, then stillness. Taken in the late afternoon, it would reach its full effect by 10 or 11 at night. Long enough for Mr. Harrow to walk to the copse after his meeting at the station, sit on the bench he favored, and wait in peace. Inspector Craddock spoke for the first time. Suicide, then. But why the elaborate arrangement? Not suicide in the usual sense of despair, Miss Marple answered. This was choice, deliberate, considered, timed. Mr. Harrow had discovered a wrong that could not be righted quietly, a small embezzlement from a client's trust fund. Not vast sums, but enough to ruin reputations if it became public in the wrong way. The person responsible was his own nephew, young, foolish, perhaps thinking it would never be noticed. Timothy drew a sharp breath, but did not look surprised. Mr. Harrow wished to protect the client, Miss Marple continued. He also wished to shield the family name from open scandal, so he made arrangements. He met the London train not for a new client, but for an old friend, a solicitor he trusted, who would receive instructions after his death. He spoke briefly on the platform, handed over a sealed envelope, then walked to the copse. There he took the dose he had prepared. He sat and waited for the appointed hour, when it would take effect. She paused, allowing the room to hold the silence. He wrote the reminder in his diary on Wednesday. JMT, first, then later, squeezed beneath it. Confirmed dose. A note to himself. A final appointment kept. And he altered our tea, so that Timothy would come here at 4, establishing the timeline, ensuring no one would search for him too soon. He chose the copse because it was quiet, because it overlooked the village he had come to care for, and because no one would disturb him there until morning. Mrs. Price spoke softly. He always said a gentleman honors his commitments, even the last one. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. This was not an act of cowardice. It was an act of responsibility. By ending his life on his own terms, he ensured the theft would be discovered naturally through the examination of papers after his death, without a public trial or family disgrace. The copies Timothy was asked to keep sealed would point quietly to the truth. The London solicitor would protect the client's interests, and the village would mourn a good man lost to sudden heart failure until the facts emerged in their proper order. Timothy looked up at last. His voice was low but steady. He never blamed me for finding the discrepancies in the accounts. He thanked me, said I'd done the right thing bringing them to him. Miss Marple reached across and patted his hand once, lightly. You did. And he trusted you to carry the message here. Not to hide anything, but to make sure the appointment was honored, even if only to cancel it. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a soft snap. The post-mortem confirms digitalis, self-administered. No note, no signs of coercion. If this explanation holds, and the papers will show whether it does, the inquest will likely return misadventure, and with mitigating circumstances of honor and duty. No one spoke for several minutes. The fire settled with a small sigh. Outside, the light had begun to slant golden across the garden, touching the last roses with warmth. Miss Marple lifted the teapot. More tea? She asked gently. They accepted, one by one. Cups were refilled. Shortbread was taken. The conversation turned, slowly, naturally, to smaller things. The weather turning cooler, the promise of frost, the way the village always found its balance again. When they rose to leave, each thanked her in his or her own way. Craddock with a firm handshake and a quiet, "You've saved us weeks of unnecessary work." Timothy with eyes that no longer looked quite so shadowed. Mrs. Price with a quick embrace and the promise of a fresh pot of honey from her sister's hives. Miss Marple stood at the door until the last of them had disappeared down the lane. Then she closed it softly, returned to the parlor, and sat once more by the fire. The explanation was complete. Not shouted, not dramatized, just laid out plainly, stitch by logical stitch, until the pattern could be seen clearly. She picked up her knitting. The lavender shawl had grown longer still. The needles began their steady rhythm again. Outside, the Sunday afternoon faded gently toward evening. Order, in its quiet way, had been restored. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. Monday morning dawned over St. Mary Mead with the kind of clear, quiet light that seems to wash away the faint shadows of the preceding days. The mist had returned overnight, thin and silvery, clinging to the hedgerows and softening the outlines of the cottages until the sun rose higher and burned it gently away. By 9 o'clock, the village had resumed its familiar cadence. The postman's whistle as he cycled past, the clatter of milk crates on doorsteps, the distant chime of the church clock marking the hour with unhurried certainty. In Miss Marple's cottage, the windows stood wide to the morning air. She had risen early, as was her habit, and spent the first hours tending small things, deadheading the last roses so the bushes could rest through winter, sweeping the front path free of fallen petals, setting fresh water in the bird bath so the sparrows could drink without fear. Ordinary tasks performed without hurry, each one a small affirmation that life continues in its proper order. And the inquest had been set for the following week, but Inspector Craddock had telephoned late the previous evening with the preliminary findings. The post-mortem confirmed digitalis poisoning, self-administered, with no evidence of external coercion. The toxicology report showed a measured dose, enough to be fatal over several hours, but not so sudden as to cause distress or alarm. Mr. Harrow's diary examined carefully, supported the timeline. The faint entry for JMT on Wednesday, the added confirmed dose beneath it, the ruled crossing out of Thursday's 4 o'clock slot. The sealed envelope given to the London solicitor on the station platform contained precise instructions: immediate audit of the trust fund, protection of the client's capital, and a private letter to the nephew urging restitution and discretion. And the nephew had already been spoken to. No arrest followed, only a quiet understanding that repayment would be made in full, privately, and that the young man would leave the village for a time to begin again elsewhere. The client, old Mrs. Abercrombie, whose modest savings had been the object of the theft, would never know how narrowly her security had been preserved. Mr. Harrow had seen to that. Miss Marple finished her morning chores and returned indoors. She set the kettle to boil, arranged a single cup and saucer on the tray, no need for 3 today, and carried it to the parlor. The fire had been lit early against the autumn chill. It burned low and steady, casting a gentle warmth across the faded chintz armchair. She settled into it with her knitting. The lavender shawl had grown considerably. Only the border remained, in a delicate pattern of eyelet holes that would give it lightness when finished. Outside, the village moved on. Young Timothy Wren had been seen walking to the solicitor's office that morning, not to close it, but to begin the slow process of sorting papers under the supervision of a senior partner sent from Much Benham. He carried himself a little straighter now, the shadows beneath his eyes less pronounced. Mrs. Price, behind her chemist's counter, had already begun to speak of Mr. Harrow in the past tense with the same quiet respect she had always shown him in life. The rose arbor dispute between Mrs. Carruthers and Mr. Linton had been settled amicably the day before. Half the blooms for each garden, a shared trellis erected along the boundary line. Even that small neighborhood quarrel had found its balance. In Miss Marple turned a row of knitting, counted the stitches under her breath, then allowed her gaze to drift to the window. The late roses still held a few petals. One pale pink bloom nodded against the glass, as though listening. She thought of Mr. Harrow, not with sorrow exactly, but with a kind of gentle understanding. He had chosen his ending as carefully as he had chosen every other part of his life. No despair had driven him, only a clear-eyed sense of duty. He had scheduled his departure so that order rather than chaos would follow. In that choice lay a certain dignity, however sorrowful. The clock on the mantel chimed 11. She set her knitting aside for a moment, rose, and crossed to the small writing desk. From the drawer she took the blue notebook in which she had listed her observations. The ink smudge on Timothy's cuff, and the repeated questions about the train, the faint entry in the diary, the single rose petal on the solicitor's step. She read the list once more, then closed the book and returned it to its place. The notes had served their purpose. The pattern was complete. She did not feel the need to discuss it further with anyone. Inspector Craddock had what he required for his report. Timothy had begun to find his footing again. The village, in its quiet way, was already knitting itself back together. There would be a memorial service in due course, simple, dignified, well attended. Flowers from many gardens would lie on the coffin. Words would be spoken about a man who had been reliable, courteous, and kind. No one would mention the diary or the dose or the envelope on the station platform. Some truths are better left to unfold privately. Yet Miss Marple returned to her chair. She picked up the lavender wool once more and resumed the border. Stitch by stitch, the eyelet pattern emerged, small, regular openings that let light pass through without weakening the fabric. She liked that about knitting, how strength and delicacy could exist together, how a single dropped stitch, if noticed early, could be repaired without anyone ever seeing the flaw. Outside, a blackbird sang from the holly bush, 3 clear notes, repeated with lazy confidence. The breeze stirred the curtains. The fire settled with a soft sigh. The village continued about its Monday business. Letters posted, bread baked, children called in from gardens for lunch. By early afternoon, the light had begun to slant, golden across the green. Miss Marple finished the last row of the shawl, cast off carefully. It had held the completed piece up to the window. The lavender wool caught the sun, soft and warm, against the pale sky. She folded it neatly, laid it across the arm of the chair, and stood for a moment, looking out. Everything was in its place again. The roses would soon be pruned back for winter. The clocks would be put back an hour when the time came. The church would ring its bells each Sunday without fail. Small dramas had played out and faded, as they always did in St. Mary Mead. Life moved forward, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but steadily, stitch by stitch. She turned from the window, took up the teacup she had left half full, and sipped the last of the now cool tea. It tasted faintly of bergamot and memory. Later, when the sun had dipped lower and the first lamps began to glow in cottage windows, she would draw the curtains, light the reading lamp beside her chair, and perhaps begin something new. A pair of mittens, perhaps, or a simple scarf in soft grey wool. There was always another project waiting, another pattern to follow. For now she sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, listening to the house settle around her. The tick of the clock, the faint crackle of the fire, the distant murmur of the village winding down toward evening. Order had been restored, not loudly proclaimed, not dramatically enforced, but quietly accepted. A man had kept his final appointment with the same courtesy he had shown in every other moment of his life. Those who remained would carry on, honoring the small promises of daily existence. A neighbor's greeting, a letter answered promptly, a rose shared across a fence. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small private smile, and the shawl lay folded beside her, finished and perfect in its quiet way. Outside, the light softened toward dusk. The village prepared for night. And in the small parlor, peace settled like a familiar blanket, warm and untroubled. Sleep well now, dear listener. The day has been long, the mystery gentle and complete. Let the quiet of St. Mary Mead carry you toward rest. The clock ticks softly. Tomorrow will come in its own good time, as it always does. Good night. Chapter 8. A gentle farewell. The days following the inquest slipped past St. Mary Mead, like leaves carried on a slow autumn stream. October had arrived in earnest now. The lime trees along the lane had turned a clear, bright gold, and the first night frosts left delicate silver patterns on the greenhouse glass. Each morning, the village woke to the same soft sounds: the scrape of coal shovels, the clink of milk bottles, the low murmur of neighbors greeting one another over garden walls. Life continued, not louder, not faster, only steadier, as though the small sorrow of Mr. Harrow's passing had been quietly absorbed into the larger rhythm of the place. Miss Marple spent these mornings in her usual way. She rose with the first pale light, made tea in the small kitchen, carried the tray to the parlor, and sat by the window to watch the day begin. The lavender shawl, finished now, lay draped across the back of her favorite chair like a quiet companion. she had given it no name. It needed none. It simply existed, soft and useful, ready for colder evenings. On the Wednesday after the inquest, she received a short letter from Timothy Wren, and the envelope was plain, the handwriting careful, but no longer quite so anxious. Inside lay a single sheet of notepaper and a small folded card. Dear Miss Marple, the senior partner has asked me to stay on and assist with closing the practice properly. I have accepted. It feels right to finish what Mr. Harrow began. The trust fund has been fully restored. The client never knew of the difficulty. I think he would have been pleased. I have enclosed something he left in the bottom drawer of his desk, addressed to no one in particular, but I believe it belongs with you. With gratitude and respect, Timothy Wren, Miss Marple, unfolded the small card. It was one of Mr. Harrow's own appointment cards, the same thick cream stock he had always used. On the front, in his neat, precise hand, tea with Miss Marple. Thursday at 4 o'clock. If I am unable to keep this appointment, please accept my apologies and know that the time was honored in spirit. Beneath it, in smaller letters added later, the roses are especially fine this year. Enjoy them while they last. She read the words twice, then set the card carefully on the mantel beside the vase of late blooms she had picked that morning. The petals, pale pink fading to cream, curled gently at the edges, but still carried their faint sweetness into the room. That afternoon, she walked to the churchyard. The path wound past the lych gate, under the ancient yew, and along the row of newer stones near the south wall. Mr. Harrow's grave was simple, a plain grey headstone, freshly set, the earth still slightly mounded. No elaborate inscription, just his name, the dates, and then below them, the single word, faithful. Someone had already placed flowers there, a small posy of white chrysanthemums tied with twine, and beside it, a single late rose, new dawn, the very variety at the heart of the old boundary dispute. Miss Marple recognized the bloom at once. It had come from Mrs. Carruthers' side of the trellis. She smiled faintly. Neighborhood quarrels, like most things, had their own way of reaching resolution. She stood a moment in silence, hands folded before her. No long prayer, no spoken words, just the quiet act of being present. The wind moved through the yew branches with a soft hiss. A robin hopped along the path, unafraid. After a while, she turned and walked slowly back towards the village green. By evening, the sky had cleared to a deep, star-pricked blue. Miss Marple drew the curtains against the chill, delit the reading lamp, and settled once more in her chair. She took up a fresh ball of wool, this time a soft heather grey, and began casting on for a pair of mittens. The needles clicked in their familiar rhythm, steady and unhurried. She thought as she worked of how the word appointment had threaded through the entire matter. At first it had seemed ordinary, a tea at 4 o'clock, a meeting at the station, a quiet conversation over boundaries and blooms. Then it had shifted, acquiring layers, a cancelled hour, a messenger sent with care, a final bench in the copse where time itself became the appointment. And at last, it had returned to simplicity, a promise kept in spirit, a rose left on a grave, a village carrying on without fanfare. Nothing had been shouted. No dramatic confessions had echoed through the lanes, and the truth had emerged stitch by stitch, revealed not through confrontation, but through patient observation, gentle questions, and the slow alignment of small facts. That, she reflected, was how most real mysteries resolved, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet certainty of daylight following night. The mittens grew row by row. The fire burned low. Outside, an owl called once from the copse beyond the railway line, a single, soft note that carried across the sleeping village. Later, when the clock chimed 10, Miss Marple set her work aside and rose to make one last cup of tea. She carried it to the window, parted the curtains a fraction, and looked out. Lights glowed in cottage windows along the lane. Smoke rose thin and straight from chimneys. The green lay silvered under the moon. Everything was as it should be, peaceful, ordinary, and all-enduring. She sipped the tea slowly, letting the warmth spread through her. Then she turned back to the room, switched off the lamp, and climbed the narrow stairs to bed. In the darkness of her bedroom, she lay listening to the house settle. The faint creak of floorboards cooling, the tick of the small clock on the dresser, the distant murmur of wind in the lime trees. No unease troubled her. The pattern was complete. The loose threads had been neatly tucked away. Sleep came gently, as it always did when order had been restored. The next morning, she would rise again, make tea, tend the garden, greet neighbors over the hedge. Small routines, repeated with quiet devotion, were the true appointment of life, the ones kept day after day without fanfare, without record, yet holding everything together. And somewhere, in the gentle turning of seasons, the memory of a punctual solicitor and his final, carefully arranged hour would fade into the larger story of the village. One thread among many, woven in and then softly covered, so that only those who looked closely would ever notice it had been there at all. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The clock ticked on. St. Mary Mead slept, and the world, in its calm and unremarkable way, continued. Chapter 9. The Last Thread. Winter settled fully over St. Mary Mead by the end of November. The frost no longer melted by midday. It lingered on rooftops and gateposts, turning the village into a quiet monochrome picture framed by bare branches and smoke from every chimney. The lanes grew slippery with thin ice in the mornings, and people walked more carefully, nodding to one another with the extra warmth that cold weather brings to small greetings. Miss Marple adapted without complaint. She wore her thickest cardigan indoors, kept the range burning steadily, and moved through her days with the same gentle deliberation she had always shown. The garden had been put to bed for the season, roses pruned hard, dahlia tubers lifted and stored in dry sand in the shed. Bird table kept filled with scraps of fat and seeds so the tits and finches would not go hungry. Small acts of care, repeated faithfully, kept the world turning in its proper circle. One grey Tuesday afternoon, just after the early dusk had begun to gather, there was a soft knock at the door. Miss Marple set aside the half-finished bed socks, now nearly complete, and went to answer it. Timothy Wren stood on the step, the coat collar turned up against the chill, a small brown paper parcel under one arm. His cheeks were pink from the cold, but his eyes were clear. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, my dear. Come in before the frost settles on your shoulders." She led him into the parlor. The fire burned bright. The room smelled of wood smoke, lemon polish, and the faint trace of bergamot from the morning's tea. Timothy unwound his scarf, accepted the chair she offered, and placed the parcel carefully on the low table between them. "I've been clearing the last of the personal drawers in Mr. Harrow's desk," he explained. "The office is to be let to a new tenant after Christmas, a young accountant from Much Benham. Most of the papers went to the archives or to the family, but this This was tucked right at the back, or behind a false panel I hadn't noticed before. Miss Marple regarded the parcel without haste. It was neatly wrapped in plain paper, tied with thin string, no address or label. "May I?" she asked. Timothy nodded. She untied the knot with careful fingers, folded back the paper, and lifted out a slim, leather-bound volume, no thicker than a pocket diary, but older, the edges worn smooth from years of handling. On the front, in faded gold lettering, barely visible, "Appointments, 1945 to 1955. She opened it gently. The pages were filled in Mr. Harrow's familiar hand, neat entries, blue ink, ruled crossings out when plans changed. But these were not the hurried notes of a solicitor's working diary. These were private. Lunch with an old school friend in London, tea with his sister before her final illness, your walk along the river on a Sunday in spring. Small moments recorded without flourish, each one dated and timed. Near the end, the entries grew sparser. Then came the last few pages. The final entry was dated the Wednesday before his death, 4 p.m. Tea with Miss Marple, proposed by her, Rose Arbor Matter. Confirmed. Later edition, same day. Confirmed dose. All arrangements in place. Client meeting at station will provide cover. Cops bench at approximately 4:30. Expected completion by 11 p.m. No disturbance anticipated. Below it, in smaller writing, almost as an afterthought. If read by kind eyes, forgive the method. It was the cleanest way to keep promises. The village has been kind. I wish to leave it untroubled. Miss Marple read the words slowly, letting each one settle. Timothy watched her face, silent. She closed the little book and laid it on her lap. He kept a separate record, she said quietly. Not for the office, for himself. A private ledger of the appointments that mattered most. Not to clients or courts, but to his own conscience. Timothy nodded. I think he wanted someone to find it. Not immediately, not publicly, just eventually. So the why would be understood, even if the how remained quiet. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Outside, the first stars were appearing through the bare branches, small and steady against the darkening sky. He honored every promise he could, she murmured, right to the last one. Even this, leaving the book where it would be found by someone he trusted to read it without judgment. Timothy's voice was low. I didn't read beyond the last page. It felt private. But I knew you should have it. Miss Marple placed her hand lightly on the cover. Thank you, Timothy. I shall keep it safe, not hidden, just held, for the time when memory needs a quiet reminder. They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled softly. The clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour. At last, Timothy rose. I should get back. The new tenant comes tomorrow to measure for shelves. Miss Marple walked him to the door. Before he stepped out into the cold, she touched his sleeve lightly. You're doing very well, my dear. Mr. Harrow would be pleased. Timothy managed a small smile. I hope so. Good night, Miss Marple. She watched him walk away down the lane until his figure blended into the dusk, then closed the door against the chill. Back in the parlor, she returned to her chair, opened the little book once more, and read the final entry again. Then she placed it carefully on the mantel, beside the appointment card he had sent through Timothy weeks earlier. The two small items stood together, quiet witnesses to a life measured in promises kept. She took up her knitting again. The bed socks were almost finished. Only the toe decreases remained. Stitch by stitch, the wool slipped through her fingers, soft and warm. Outside, the frost deepened. The village lights glowed behind curtained windows. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. The stars grew brighter in the clear, cold sky. Miss Marple worked on, unhurried. The pattern was simple, predictable, comforting. When the last stitch was cast off, she would fold the socks neatly, wrap them in tissue, and give them to old Mrs. Dane for her husband, who always felt the cold in his feet first. Another small promise kept. She smiled faintly at the fire. The last thread had been drawn through. No loose ends remained. The house settled around her with its familiar sounds. The tick of the clock, the sigh of the fire, the faint creak of beams cooling in the night. Tomorrow would bring its own appointments, tea to make, birds to feed, a neighbor's greeting over the hedge. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic. Only the gentle continuity of days well lived. Miss Marple set the finished socks aside, rose, and turned down the lamp. The room faded into soft shadow. She climbed the stairs slowly, carrying the small leather book in her hand. In her bedroom, she placed it on the bedside table, slipped under the eiderdown, and let the quiet wrap around her. Sleep came without resistance, deep, calm, untroubled. Outside, and the frost sparkled under the moon, St. Mary Mead rested. And in the stillness, every promise that mattered had been honored at last. Good night, dear listener. The winter night is long and peaceful. Let the gentle rhythm of the village carry you into rest. All is quiet. All is well. Chapter 10. Winter's Quiet. Close December arrived in St. Mary Mead with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. The snow that had begun as light flurries in late November had thickened into a proper covering, several inches deep, softening every roofline, muffling every footstep, turning the village green into a wide, unbroken sheet of white. Icicles hung from gutters like crystal pendants. The lime trees stood bare and patient under their white burden. The church spire rose sharp and dark against a sky the color of old pewter. And Miss Marple welcomed the season without fuss. She had long ago learned that winter was not something to fight, but something to live alongside, quietly, warmly, one small comfort at a time. Each morning, she rose while the house was still dark, lit the range, filled the kettle, and carried tea to the parlor where the fire had been banked the night before and now needed only a poker and a few fresh coals to wake again. The windows framed a world painted in silver and grey. Inside, the room glowed with lamplight and the soft crackle of burning wood. The lavender shawl had been replaced on the armchair by a heavier wool blanket in deep plum, folded ready for evenings when the chill crept under doors. The bed socks she had finished for old Mr. Dane had been delivered with a tin of homemade ginger biscuits. He had sent back by way of his wife, in a jar of his own damson jam, and a note in shaky pencil. Warm feet and warm thanks. Winter's easier with both. Timothy Wren continued his visits. They had settled into a rhythm. Every other Saturday afternoon, he arrived with frost on his coat and a small offering, a newspaper clipping about a new rose variety, a packet of lemon drops from the shop, once even a sprig of holly he had cut from the churchyard hedge. They sat by the fire, drank tea, spoke of ordinary things. He no longer mentioned the diary or the dose or the envelope on the station platform. Those matters had found their place and were no longer carried openly. One such Saturday, as the light began to fail early, Timothy set down his cup and said, "The new accountant moved in last week. Young fellow, nervous but keen. He asked if I'd stay another year to show him the ropes. And I said yes. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. You've become part of the place now. Roots take time, but once they're down, they hold. Timothy looked into the fire. I think Mr. Harrow would have approved. He always said continuity matters more than brilliance in a village practice. He was right, she answered gently. Brilliance dazzles for a moment. Continuity carries the years. They sat in companionable quiet after that. Outside, snow began to fall again, fine flakes drifting past the window like slow confetti. Timothy left just as the street lamps were lit, their glow haloed by the descending white. Miss Marple watched him go until he turned the corner, then closed the door and returned to the warmth. Christmas came and went with its usual gentle ceremony. The church was filled with candlelight and carols. The children sang in slightly off-key voices. Wreaths of holly and ivy decorated every door. Miss Marple attended midnight service, wrapped in her heaviest coat, and returned home through snow that crunched underfoot. She spent Christmas Day alone by choice. Tea, a small roast chicken, a slice of fruit cake sent by Mrs. Price, and the fire burning bright. No loneliness attended the day, only peace. In the new year, the snow thawed slowly, leaving the lanes muddy and the gardens sodden. Crocuses pushed through the wet earth in small, brave clusters of purple and gold. The days lengthened by minutes each afternoon. Miss Marple resumed her walks, short ones at first, then longer as the ground dried. She passed the solicitor's office, now bearing a fresh brass plate with the new name, and saw Timothy through the window, head bent over papers, him working with the same steady care his predecessor had shown. One mild February morning, she found herself once more at the churchyard. The grave was no longer mounded. Grass had knitted over it completely. A single snowdrop had bloomed beside the headstone, white, fragile, defiant in the cold. Miss Marple bent and brushed a few stray flakes from its petals. She did not linger long. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to settle. The small leather appointment book rested on her mantel now, beside the card and a dried new dawn rose pressed between two sheets of tissue. They formed a quiet triptych, reminders, not of sorrow, but of a life measured carefully, and concluded with the same courtesy it had always shown. Back at the cottage, she made fresh tea, carried it to the parlor, and sat with her knitting. On a new project, a baby blanket in pale yellow wool for the daughter of the new postmistress, expected in spring. The stitches were simple, garter all the way, no pattern to count, only the soothing repetition of needle through loop. As she worked, her thoughts drifted, not to the mystery that had once occupied them, but to the larger, gentler mystery of time itself. How it carried people forward, how it folded small moments into years, how it allowed even the saddest choices to become part of something enduring. Mr. Harrow had understood that. He had chosen his final appointment so the village could continue without fracture, quietly, steadily, faithfully. The blanket grew inch by inch. The fire burned low. Outside, the afternoon light strengthened. A blackbird sang from the holly bush. 3 clear notes repeated with confidence. Miss Marple finished a row, then set the needles aside for a moment. She looked toward the window. The snowdrops in her own garden had opened too, small white bells trembling in the breeze. Spring was not far now. She smiled, small and private. Everything had its season. Appointments were kept or gracefully rearranged. Promises, once made, were honored in spirit, even when the body could not keep them. And the village, small, ordinary, enduring, moved on, stitch by stitch, day by day. She took up the knitting once more. The yellow wool slipped smoothly through her fingers. The clock ticked softly. The fire settled. St. Mary Mead rested under the pale winter sun. And in the quiet parlor, a gentle story reached its close. Not with fanfare, not with tears, but with the calm certainty that all necessary threads had been drawn through, tied off, no one laid to rest. Sleep well now, dear listener. The winter is passing, the days are growing longer. Let the soft rhythm of the village carry you towards spring. All is peaceful, all is as it should be. Good night.